Victory in a war is often viewed as a product of courage, luck, or raw aggression. But Sun Tzu tells us that true strategic victory is actually a matter of cold sequential geometry. It is a mathematical ladder. If you skip a single rung on this ladder, your entire campaign will collapse under its own weight. Sun Tzu breaks this down into the 5 foundations of planning. First, measurement of the land. Second, estimation of forces or supplies. Third, calculation of troop numbers. Fourth, comparison between the two armies. 5. And finally, the ultimate assessment of whether you can win. When a conqueror aligns these 5 steps perfectly, Sun Tzu says the resulting onslaught is like the bursting of pent-up waters into a chasm 1,000 fathoms deep. But when a military command gets the very first step wrong, it triggers a catastrophic domino effect. To see how this mechanical failure plays out in real life, we have to look back at Russia's initial 2022 blitzkrieg towards Kyiv. Let's trace the steps back exactly as Sun Tzu intended. Step 1 is measurement of the land. If you measure the terrain, you know the size, the density, and the choke points of the landscape. In February 2022, the Russian General Staff catastrophically failed at Step 1. They mapped out an invasion route from Belarus to Kyiv through the dense forest, narrow highways, and the swampy floodplains of northern Ukraine. They treated the map like a flat tabletop, ignoring the physical reality of the earth. Because they mismeasured the land, they failed at Step 2, estimation. Sun Tzu says understanding the landscape tells you what types of troops can operate there, or in alternative translations, how much food and fuel that land can supply. Russia estimated that their heavy, armored tank columns could easily roll down the few paved northern highways. They completely failed to estimate how soft, muddy terrain on either side of those roads would trap their vehicles, or how long their fuel supplies would actually last if they got stuck. This led directly to a failure in Step 3, calculation of troop numbers. Because Russia assumed a rapid, uncontested 3-day drive through favorable terrain, they calculated that they only need a relatively small vanguard force of around 30 to 40,000 troops along that northern axis to seize the capital. They did not calculate for a protracted, grinding fight in the dense suburbs. And that brings us to Step 4, comparison. When you look at the infamous 40-mile-long armored convoy that choked the highway outside of Kyiv in the opening weeks, you are looking at a structural failure of comparison. Russia compared their paper strength to what they thought was a weak Ukrainian defense. But in reality, their bottlenecked, fuel-starved columns were being picked apart by highly mobile Ukrainian teams armed with anti-tank missiles and precision artillery. The baseline math was completely broken. Russia compared a flawed illusion against a harsh reality. Only after you have run the first 4 stages can you reach Step 5, the assessment of the likelihood of victory. Because Russia's initial foundations were built on a fantasy, their assessment of victory was totally wrong. They sought battle before the victory was won. Sun Tzu says a truly victorious army, opposed to a routed one, is like a heavy pound weight placed in the scale against a single grain. When Ukraine successfully forced a total Russian retreat from the north, it was because they had balanced the scales. They knew the geometry of their own land, they calculated the exact forces needed to clog the highways, and they made the outcome inevitable. Sun Tzu's ultimate war tip reminds us to trust the process, not the propaganda. Measure the land. Use that raw data to estimate the enemy's numbers and logistical constraints. Honestly compare both forces, and only then, when the math tilts heavily in your favor, unleash the water into the chasm. To bring it all together, planning a successful military campaign is not an act of blind faith or raw aggression. It is a strict mathematical domino effect. If the first tile falls incorrectly, every single subsequent calculation will collapse along with it. As the catastrophic failure of Russia's initial rush into Kyiv demonstrates, you cannot cheat Sun Tzu's geometric ladder. When you mismeasure the physical limitations of the Earth, you fail to estimate the logistical vulnerabilities. When you fail to estimate your vulnerabilities, your troop calculations are wrong, your comparison against enemy's real strength becomes a fantasy, and your final assessment of victory turns into a trap. When navigating any high-stakes plan or campaign, run through Sun Tzu's 5 baseline steps with brutal honesty. Respect the terrain. Always start measuring the reality on the ground you are operating on. Understand its choke points, its density, and its hidden friction before you move an inch. Audit the logistics. Use your knowledge of the landscape to estimate what resources, supplies, and types of forces can actually survive there. Never assume a flat path where mud, distance, or bottlenecks can drain your energy. Balance the scales before the fight. Honestly calculate the numbers. Compare your true capabilities against the enemy's real strength. And only unleash your force when the math weighs the scales completely in your favor. A true strategist never relies on hope. They rely on the math of inevitability. Build your foundation sequentially. Calculate every variable, and let your victory be as unstoppable as the pent-up waters bursting into a deep chasm.